All right, guys, this is a big weekend on the Belt of Truth channel. It is the re-release of Schooled, the deliberate agenda to destroy individuality, reduce intelligence, and re-engineer society. And that's a mouthful, but it is Satan's multi-pronged, diabolical, apocalyptic agenda to capture the minds of the masses heading into the final deceptions of the last days. He knows that his time is short, he is with great wrath, and he deceiveth the whole world. And when you can capture them from an early age through the media, that's our most watched seminar, Media on the Brain, but also through the schooling system, second most watched seminar, Schooled. So enjoy this right now, part 1, part 2 to follow also in a second posting. But remember, even more importantly than doing the expose of these methods of the enemy, to look upon the true, the good, the noble, the right, the lovely, the admirable, the excellent, the praiseworthy, as it is in God's blueprint, the true education blueprint. The seminar on that topic, which is hinted at in all of this that you're going to see in Schooled, that one is called Undoctrinated. How home education and schools of the prophets will produce the last generation. Just send me an email. I'm going to show you how to watch that one after you watch this. ScottRitsema@gmail.com. I'll send you a link to Undoctrinated. But for now, enjoy Schooled. It'll be very enlightening, historical analysis and biblical principles, and revealing the great controversy for the minds of the youth. The year was 1843. American society was in the midst of an absolute revival and interest in the soon coming of Jesus. But something else was happening also in 1843. Another religious movement was afoot. The man you see on the screen, Horace Mann, was visiting the nation of Prussia. He was visiting the nation of Prussia because he was very interested in exploring and examining the schooling system in that nation. When he got to Prussia to watch the schools in action and learn what was going on, he found actually the schools were on vacation, and he arrived to empty school buildings. He interviewed a few teachers, looked through some papers, and sailed back to America. The year 1844, he released his 7th annual report to the Boston School Committee, where he called Massachusetts to institute a Prussian-style schooling system in the state of Massachusetts. Now, of course, he didn't know much about the system because he had not seen it, but he proclaimed that he learned all these things about it. That's example 1. Example 2. The man you see on the screen, Wilhelm Wundt, is the prophet of modern schooling, perhaps the most important individual in the formation of Prussian-style schooling, which later comes to America, as you're going to hear. He penned a total of 53,735 pages of educational philosophy during his nearly 70-year career, interestingly spanning about the same time period as another 70-year writing career of another prophet you may know. That's example 2. Take a look at this quotation. Every teacher should realize he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order. The teacher always is the prophet of the true God, speaking of modern prophets. And the teacher also is the usherer in of the true kingdom of God, said John Dewey, perhaps the single most influential thinker on modern schooling. Welcome to a seminar entitled Schooled. This is a 2-part seminar where we are looking at the movement, and particularly in American history, of modern schooling. And you see that right in the midst of this religious awakening, this movement of God's last days people being risen up, there was another movement going on. And it was a very religious movement, as you've seen. As you've seen John Dewey say, the usherer in of the true kingdom of God is the teacher, because he's bringing about a certain social order. Now, of course, when people think of school today, they think of the school bus. 48,000 school buses carry tens of millions of children away from home each morning. And the bus, as well as the school, are, in the American mind at least, pretty sacred emblems. You don't criticize or question these institutions. These are wonderful, positive things. But upon closer examination, maybe they're not. If you look at school, just scratch under that surface a little bit. This is a place where condoms are being handed out to middle schoolers. Mom and dad don't get to know, no permission needed. This is a place where children are indoctrinated with worldviews like secular humanism, Darwinism, even postmodern relativism, that there are no morals, right or wrong. Is school such a good thing after all? You might not be surprised that nearly half of all high schoolers have had premarital sex. Nearly half of high schoolers smoke, drink, or use drugs. But what might surprise you is that the Department of Education in the United States did an investigation where they launched a search into the schooling system to find out how much sexual impropriety was going on. What they discovered is that 10% of children in public schools have been targets of unwanted sexual attention by school staff. And again, it may not surprise you that they're smoking, drinking, and doing drugs, but what might surprise you is that there are literally millions that are being put, by the officials, being put on legal mind-altering drugs. Now, of course, parents send their children to schools with the best of intentions. They believe that the future education of their children is at stake, whether they're going to be good, productive citizens, they must be in school. But is it so necessary? It's worth asking, because other than media consumption, which we've talked extensively about, school is where children spend pretty much the rest of their time. Children today, they don't have a lot of focused time with mom and dad. They don't spend time working, learning skills with their hands, experiencing the real world in real life. Very little of those things. Basically, the reality of kids today is school and media consumption. We've looked at that one enough, but how about schooling? Is this something that we should have such confidence in? I believe we have extreme levels of naivete about this. Now, we are going to talk about many individuals, human beings, throughout history, like the men you see on the screen. But before I launch into the history, I want to be really, really clear on something. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. Our battle is against the principalities and powers of darkness. So don't look at these men and say, they are the great enemy. We must wage our attack upon people and expose their evil behavior. We are going to quote them. We will see what their plan, these architects of modern schooling, what they have built. But remember that Satan himself is the enemy of souls, not these human beings. In fact, speaking of the powers of darkness, listen to what Messages to Young People says. The powers of darkness strive to gain control of the human mind. Now, this is Messages to Young People, so this is about the young mind. Satan's agenda is to gain control of the minds of children. And that's no surprise. If you can get them while they're young, then you're going to have them through the rest of their life. Why talk about education then? Because I believe that schooling, other than media, is the second most potent area of control where Satan is gaining control of the human mind. And we also read in Mind, Character, and Personality that now as never before, we need to understand the true science of education. If we fail to understand this, we shall never have a place in the kingdom of God. So this is a salvation issue. This is a very serious issue at stake. People's salvation is on the line. Not just with our media consumption, but also with our schooling. Now, of course, I am a teacher. I've been a teacher for 11 years, but my schooling story begins a long, long time ago. You see a picture that I actually snapped a picture of right out of my mom's photo album. That's me, the older kid there, going to my first day of school, evading the hug and kiss by my little brother there. 1985, heading into the public school system. Now, at that time, I was 4 years old going to kindergarten, but I actually began school at age 3 in preschool, which is not uncommon today. Now, if you're a part of literally the 1/3 of America, this is largely going to be a history of American education. So if you're somewhere else in the world, a lot of this stuff has bled into all over the world. But if you're part of the 1/3 of the American society that's literally in the schooling business, I'm one of you, okay? I started school at age 3. I went all the way through and then taught for 11 years. From age 3 to age 33, I've been in the schooling business. So this isn't meant to be a criticism of people who are in the schooling enterprise, but that's where I've spent my life. I've been in 13 different schools as a teacher or as a student, different kinds of schools. I've taught in public schools, Christian schools, charter schools, Adventist schools, done the rural, the urban, the suburban, all of the above. And so I having experienced all this and studied the history, I really feel a burden to share with people what's really going on in the schooling movement. Now, as a kid, I guess it's highly ironic that I became a teacher because I had a severe distaste for reading. What you see on the screen is another photo I snapped a picture of out of my mom's photo album. And you see the caption there. It says, "I hate reading." Now, the reason that my mom wrote, "I hate reading" right there is because you almost never would have found me reading a book as a kid. Almost never. She saw it like once here or twice and took a picture every time to catalog that for all history and posterity to see that he actually did read a couple of times as a kid. And so I had a severe distaste for reading as a child. But I was from a family where I had two older siblings that were really good students. They loved to read and they got good grades. And so I came from an academic family. So when I got involved in school, I guess, I wanted to do well in school. I wanted to get good grades, partly because I was just very competitive. So I wanted to perform well and get the good grades, but with the very minimum amount of learning possible. Don't do too much learning, still get good grades. That was the goal. So I had to figure out, I guess what you might call the game of schooling. Here's how the game of schooling goes. First, figure out how the teacher calculates the final grade. This is essential. And then you work proportionately within those categories of the teacher's grade. Now, don't apply any effort outside those categories. Secondly, figure out which tasks earn points, and only do those tasks that earn points. Third, to assure full credit on assigned tasks, submit exactly what the teacher is looking for. When in doubt of what she's looking for, ask her. Never, ever try to be creative or independent. Just do what the teacher wants you to do. Fourth, also to assure full credit, be sure to do the tasks a little better than most of the other students. As long as you're competitive with them, beating most of your peers, you'll get good grades almost all the time. Fifth, pay attention to and take notes on only that which the teacher indicates will be on the test. When in doubt, ask her and she will probably tell you. Number 6, submit the test information to short-term memory through minimal study and memorization techniques in order to score well on the test. And of course, you'll forget the information later, but you got the grade. Calculate your grade as it's going. Go to the teacher often. Calculate that grade down to this decimal place, and then find the easiest extra credit assignment to bring the grade up to the next highest mark. This was the game of school that I played for years. In fact, math is just a little bit different than some of these steps. Within math class, you have to watch how the teacher does the problem, learn the formula, and then basically all the other problems are going to be the same kind of problem that he showed you how to do. So you memorize a formula and you just solve the problem. You're not solving any real problems. You're just plugging numbers into a preset formula that you've memorized. And then you could score well on math tests and, of course, submit your math homework. Minimal. And as a student, I didn't learn deep thinking, deep reading, deep analysis. I learned as little as possible, but when I graduated high school, I had a 3.5 GPA. Now, here's the real funny thing about the 3.5 GPA. I went 4 years of high school. 3.5, by the way, in America is like halfway between an A- and a B+. Okay, so that's pretty good grades. It's enough to earn an honors scholarship to college. And that's why I wanted the 3.5, because it was money, right? So I went 4 years of high school, though, without ever reading a single book. 4 years of high school, didn't read a single book, got a 3.5 GPA because I learned the game of school. Now, by the way, the GPA was 3.500 because I didn't want to put in 1 ounce of effort beyond what was absolutely needed in order to get the honors scholarship. And so going into my last exams to calculate that grade point average, I remember that I could determine what my grade would be on the exam before I ever took it by knowing how much to study and how much to memorize. And so I knew what grades I was going to get on all the final exams before walking in. I'm going to get a B- on this one, an A on that one, an A- on that one, and an A- on that one, or whatever. And by deciding how much to study for each one, and I could choose my own grade. That's exactly how I ended up with a 3.500 because I knew what needed to be scored on in order to round it out at 3.5. So I look back on my own schooling history. It's somewhat humorous, but it's also kind of sad. What a lot of wasted time, right? I mean, I finally got to college and began to become interested in actual learning. And that was mostly on my own. Almost everything I've learned, almost everybody will tell you this, almost everything that we've learned in life did not take place in a classroom, right? So the classroom was like the time you had to serve in order to get onto more interesting things in life. As a kid, interesting things were just media and entertainment, the sports world, all of this kind of waste of time stuff. But as a college student, the free time was spent studying and learning about how the world really works, studying history, studying theology. So that's my schooling story. But it's hard for us to imagine today a world without full-time schooling. We take it for granted that it's inevitable. It has to be a part of reality. Isn't that the way that God designed reality? Maybe not. Let's just go back a little ways in history, just 200 years or so in American history. Schooling was not the idolized enterprise that it is today. In fact, 250 years ago, teachers were often convicts who were serving out the remainder of their sentence, and they had to teach in order to finish their prison sentence. George Washington's own teacher was an example of that. Was a convict. But even though the teaching profession wasn't this lifted up on a pedestal kind of thing, there was still teaching happening all the time. There was teaching happening because there were teachers everywhere. Mom and dad are teachers, aunts and uncles, grandma and grandpa, the guy down the road who has a business doing this, the blacksmith across the street, basically anybody who was living life, who had a passion, who had a skill, maybe a tutor who had some knowledge of literature, whatever it might be, they were all potential teachers. So learning happened all the time, even without compulsory schooling. In American history 200 years ago, there was no such thing as full-time schooling as we know it today. It's hard for us to imagine a world without it, but people lived very successful lives. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself only went to school for the equivalent of 1 year of formal schooling in his entire life, and that was scattered throughout. But that's not just Lincoln either. The most accomplished men of the 18th and 19th centuries in American history, same thing. They were self-taught men, self-made men. Attended a little bit of schooling, maybe had a little bit of a tutor, but for the most part, they learned on their own, kind of like all of us do with most of the most important things we've learned in our lives outside of the classroom. The small farmer in America, just 150 years ago, he was really, really firm, typically, in wanting to toughen his mind, reading rigorous writings, debate, dialogue, doing his own accounting, even writing. The American farmer was not some sort of, redneck that you might imagine that was ignorant and illiterate. No. In fact, in the 1840s still, when the schooling movement started that we're going to tell the history of today, in the 1840s, complex literacy in America was virtually 100%. In Connecticut, only 1 out of 500 people was illiterate. And so this is a time in history where you didn't need to be professionally educated in order to be considered, to be a person of knowledge. In fact, if you look at the great Advent awakening, the religious movements of the 19th century, it's no surprise they came from farmers and even school dropouts. Listen to this quotation from Christian education. Our Savior did not ignore learning or despise education, yet He chose unlearned fishermen for the work of the gospel, because they had not been schooled in the false customs and traditions of the world. So Peter, James, John, the disciples, they had not been schooled with a false education, and that qualified them for the work. Now I want to go back to these farmers again of the late 18th century. Have you ever heard of the Federalist Papers? This is a very important series of documents that were published in the 1780s to try to convince the New York farmer to advocate for the passage of the Constitution. Would the Constitution be ratified or not? 1787. Big question in American history. And the farmers of New York State were a very important voting bloc in this. So Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison put together the Federalist Papers, and they argued for this. Who was the audience? The American farmer. We're reading the Federalist Papers. Now, that might not come as such a surprise until you actually hear them. Listen to an excerpt from the Federalist Papers. It may be objected to this, that not 7, but 9 states, or 2/3 of the whole number, must consent to the most important resolutions. And it may be thence inferred that 9 states would always comprehend a majority of the Union. But this does not obviate the impropriety of an equal vote between the states of the most unequal dimensions and populousness, nor is the inference accurate in point of fact. For if we can enumerate 9 states which contain less than a majority of the people, and it is constitutionally possible that these 9 may give the vote, besides there are matters of considerable moment, determinable by a bare majority, and there are others concerning which doubts have been entertained, which, if interpreted in favor of the sufficiency of a vote of the 7 states, would extend its operation to the interests of the first magnitude. Now you see, even I struggled to read this. I have a master's degree in this kind of stuff, and this is hard. I'm guessing that went over our heads for the most part, right? But the average New York State farmer was reading this for fun after his day of work, sitting around the table with the neighbors and with the family, debating and discussing these issues. These guys were bright. In fact, in the 1770s, when Common Sense was published by Thomas Paine, it was literally the majority of the free population of Virginia that purchased a copy of Common Sense and read it. That's incredible. Now, people might say, well, that was way back then. I mean, things are different today. Well, let's look at a different country today. In Switzerland, only 23% of the students go to high school. Switzerland is one of the most prosperous societies in the entire world. It actually has the highest per capita income in the world. So if you want to get a good education, it's not necessarily essential to sit in a desk full-time, year-round for 13 years. The people back then in American history certainly didn't have that experience. But the kids who did go to school in the 1880s, they'd have a short period of school, a short term, and these fifth graders were reading George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, among others. I'd like to read for you an excerpt from George Washington's farewell address so that you can hear the kind of literacy level that these fifth graders were able to comprehend. The acceptance of and continuance hitherto in the office to which your suffrages have twice called me have been a uniform sacrifice of inclination to the opinion of duty and to a deference for what appeared to be your desire. I constantly hoped that it would have been much earlier in my power, consistently with motives which I was not at liberty to disregard, to return to the retirement from which I had been reluctantly drawn. The strength of my inclination to do this, previous to the last election, had even led to the preparation of an address to declare it to you. But mature reflection on the then perplexed and critical posture of our affairs with foreign nations, and the unanimous advice of persons entitled to my confidence, impelled me to abandon the idea. Now, that was, again, really, really tough stuff. I added up the number of words there. That was a total of 3 sentences. And the average sentence had 45 words in it. 45 words per sentence. This is pretty high-level stuff, okay? Now I want to compare George Washington's farewell address with a more recent farewell address from another president named George. But remember that in the last 100 years in American history, we have had the schooling movement come in. We have had full-time schooling. So after all of that experience in American history that we're going to study, this is the experience of literacy in America. After a century of compulsory schooling in America, after kids have been schooled full-time for 13 years, K to 12, after spending about 15,000 hours in school and on schoolwork by the age of 18, and after spending an average of $156,000 tax dollars per public school child for his 13 years of education, this is the kind of farewell address we are able to comprehend today. I have experienced setbacks. There are things I would do differently if given the chance. Yet I have always acted with the best interests of our country in mind. I have followed my conscience and done what I thought was right. You may not agree with some tough decisions I have made, but I hope you can agree that I was willing to make the tough decisions. Do you see the contrast? This is 11 words per sentence, 6 sentences over that. So 25% of the length of George Washington's sentences, 75% reduction in just the length of the sentence, not to mention the verbiage used. Literacy is not what it once was. I decided to do a little test on these. You can actually just copy and paste literature right into a form online, and it will automatically identify the grade level, the reading level of it, according to a number of different measures. And so I put George Bush's in, and his farewell address was at the 5th grade reading level. You can see it right there in very small print with the arrow next to it. That's an average of a bunch of different measures of the grade level, reading level. So George W. Bush presented his, by the way, this is not a criticism of President Bush. He doesn't even write his own speeches, and of course they're going to speak at the level of the people. So, but it's at a 5th grade reading level. Now what about George Washington? I plugged his in. This is absolutely amazing. George Washington's is at today's reading level, which what would be called 19. Grade 19. I've never even heard of grade 19. What is that? Well, grade 19, I suppose grade 12 is the senior year of high school, right? So beyond 12, you would have to be in school for 7 more years in order to comprehend George Washington, which kids were reading in 5th grade in the 1880s. Now that shows you how dumbed down we have become, just on the level of literacy. By the way, just for fun, I put in the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence into this form. You know what grade level? Just the preface of the Declaration of Independence, America's most important founding document, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that document. It was grade 25.8. So apparently you're supposed to go to school for 26 years in order to comprehend the basic founding document that declared America's independence from Britain and declared that all men are created equal. You're going to see, by the way, that this was a deliberate plan to dumb down the masses. You don't have a people this far gone from any intelligence, this much dumbed down, unless there's been an agenda at play. Now, let's see also what has happened just in the last part of the 20th century. Between 1940 and 2000, black illiteracy in America doubled, white illiteracy quadrupled. Also in 1997, nearly 50% of the population was either illiterate or functioning at low levels of literacy. Only 18 to 21% of Americans are fully functionally literate. Between 1975 and 2000, there was a 37% decline in the number of individuals who were scoring above 600 on the SAT, even as the test was becoming easier. And also American students, who used to rank at the top internationally of academic measures, now rank 23rd out of 65 industrialized countries in math. In all subjects, the longer American kids are in school, the worse they measure up to other countries. Finland, who ranks near or at the top of virtually all educational categories, their kids, over their childhood, spend almost 50% fewer hours in school as our kids. So in Finland, they go to school about half as much from age 5 to 18. They're in school about half as long because they start later, their school year is shorter, about half as much schooling, but far superior academically. Very interesting. We also see that in the last half of the 20th century, teachers' salaries rose 50%, class sizes dropped 40%, the non-teaching bureaucracy grew 500%, and money spent on public education increased threefold. Kids now spend longer in school than ever before, and young adults are getting college degrees at higher rates than ever before. So the answer to our problem of dumbness is not more schooling, more funding for the schools, smaller classes, pay teachers more. All of this stuff has been going up and up and up and up. School is the problem, not the solution, and you'll see why as we look at the history. Only 31% of college-educated Americans can fully comprehend a simple newspaper story, which are aimed at very low reading levels. 30% of Americans cannot identify the Pacific Ocean on a blank map, and a full 26% of Americans actually believe the sun revolves around the earth. Now, you don't have to be at that level of total ignorance in order to say, whoa, we've been dumbed down, because the we is me and you too. I mean, that's a shocking example, but the rest of us, we know the earth, that we don't know that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, but can we read? Can we understand complex literacy, analyze a text, truly comprehend it? We're all really struggling with this sort of thing. So here's a statement from Christian education that says, close reasoners, this is over 100 years ago this began, close reasoners and logical thinkers are few, for the reason that false influences have checked the development of the intellect. So this seminar, this session and session 2 is going to be an analysis of those false influences. What is the history of modern schooling that came in and has so dumbed us down? I'm going to begin way back in the history, back in Europe, in the Dark Ages. The model of social control in the Dark Ages, the way that the elite planners of society would control the masses and control the society, was by keeping them in total ignorance. That's why we call it the Dark Ages, right? There was no printing press. They were not able to read. The Bible was not translated into the common tongue. And so the people were very easily corralled and controlled. But then something happened in the history. William Tyndale, John Wycliffe, John Huss, Martin Luther, and of course, Gutenberg and his printing press. The Reformation absolutely exploded literacy throughout Europe. People were reading the Bible in print, in their own language, and they were learning, and they were thinking, and they were questioning the reality that was presented to them. All of a sudden, the elite priest class doesn't have such control over society. There needed to be something done about it. So the Counter-Reformation took place. The Jesuit order was formed. The Jesuits were a part of the Counter-Reformation, seeking to counter what was happening with all these people rising up and saying no to the system. And we hear from Bertrand Russell what kind of education they imposed. The Jesuits provided one sort of education for the boys who were to become ordinary men of the world, and another for those who were to become members of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. So the Jesuit education model says we can't have all these people thinking for themselves. We've got to corral the masses and control their thought. They need to be contented. They need to be thoughtless. And this is the mass of society. Certainly we will have a select few that we educate differently, inducted into the elite. But the masses will be controlled through schooling. Now, there was a nation at this time also, a couple centuries later, that mastered Jesuit-style education, or schooling rather, and that was the nation of Prussia. Johann Gottlieb Fichte addressed the German nation in 1807, and he said the following. He's an educational philosopher. He says, education should provide the means to destroy free will. This is Jesuit education to the core. It became known as Prussian education. He also says, if you want to influence the student at all, you must do more than merely talk to him. You must fashion him. And fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. So do you hear the agenda? Destroy the free will, get rid of his own will, you must fashion him. Now this Prussian-style schooling, the goal was to produce in their army obedient soldiers, in their factories, obedient and subordinated industrial workers. This was a military state where they said, we want to be the strongest empire in Europe, and they had just been defeated by Napoleon's army. They went back to the drawing board. They said, never again. We have got to take seriously the schooling of our children. We have to get them trained in uniformity of thought and eliminate all dissent. It's the perfect propaganda plan, isn't it? Start when they're young, raise them up through state education, and you've got them as yours. So Prussia, nearly the entire population was required to attend schools where the intended purpose was not to teach actual education. It was to produce compliance. And they would learn the basics of literacy. You can't put that printing press cat back in the bag. I mean, people can learn to read on their own if they want, but you corral them, harness them into this system, and you have the illusion of education. You teach them the rudiments of literacy, teach them some myths of state history so that they're propagandized to believe in the system. And most importantly, they are made into obedient cogs in the industrial and military machine. Deep thinking and reading were not encouraged. Questioning the reality that is presented to you is just treason. It's just not allowed. Now, what were the fruits of this Jesuit-style education as imposed in the nation of Prussia? You can see it 100 years later in Germany. The Nazi movement was a movement not just of youth, but of people who were all on board. We are going to follow this great leader. We are going to do whatever the masters say. How is it that all of these intelligent people, that this nation of people were able to be so manipulated into this movement? Schooling played a big part in that, because Germany, of course, incorporated much of Prussia when it was consolidated as a unified state in the late 19th century. So Prussian-style education was imported into Germany. Now, here you have Horace Mann. What does this have to do with American history? In 1840, Horace Mann initiated a series of secret meetings among the elite of Massachusetts. And these meetings, called the Massachusetts School Committee, they met to discuss how can we now import Prussian-style education, Jesuit education, into America. By the way, Horace Mann is the father of American schooling. So he's the guy that traveled to Prussia in the 1840s, came back, and really pushed this movement forward. The Massachusetts School Committee discussed these things. He presented his 7th annual report to the Boston, Massachusetts School Committee in 1844. And he and his cohorts called upon Massachusetts to institute compulsory, forced schooling, required attendance, just like in Germany, just like in Prussia, where the majority or virtually all of the children would have to be in this system. And what did they call for? Grouping students by age, a non-intellectual subject matter, multiple layers of administrative supervision, and a teacher training program to get the teachers on board with this new style of schooling. Now, also at the time on the screen you see William Miller. He's the one that began the great Second Advent Awakening movement in America. And at the time, the folks who were following Miller's movement, who were proclaiming the soon coming of Jesus, that it was going to be a premillennial coming. He was not going to come after 1,000 years of peace and perfection on earth, post-millennial. No, these premillennial believers, they were heretics in day. In the 1840s, they were being kicked out of their churches. So the Congregationalist and the Baptist and the Methodist ministers in the 1840s who were disfellowshipping Advent believers, guess what else they were doing? They were getting behind Horace Mann. It was the Protestant clergy that was essential in bringing this schooling movement into Massachusetts and elsewhere. Why? Because they believed, well, hey, you know what? If we can get all the kids in the schools, we can indoctrinate them with Protestantism because there's some Catholic immigration happening here, and we want to make sure that we have good Congregationalists in our community, good Baptists, good Methodists, not Catholics. And so they sold out. They made a deal with the devil. And here they were a key demographic and voting bloc in moving this movement forward. And it's all history from there. In 1852, Massachusetts became the first state in the country to enact a compulsory schooling law. And people at the time, by the way, understood how radical this was. This is not so much talked about in the histories. You probably never even heard about this. But people at the time sure knew what was going on. In 1850, it was the single biggest topic being discussed in Massachusetts political circles. In 1852, when the law was passed, children were required to go to school. Parents received the notification. A lot of them said, no, we're not going to send our kids to these Prussian-style schools. Well, the militia came out in many cases and actually marched the children to school. Schools were, in some cases, burned to the ground. Teachers were run out of town by angry mobs. Parents broke into schools and freed their children. And this wasn't happening in every single school. And by the way, these aren't the heroes of the story. You know, we shouldn't be like, yes, burn schools. No, this isn't a good guys, bad guys story. But this was the response of people who were not happy with this situation. Many people knew what was going on. Even as early as 1839, one commentator wrote, where the whole tendency of education is to create obedience, all teachers must be pliant tools of the government. Such a system of education is not inconsistent with the theory of Prussian society, but the thing is wholly inadmissible here. The fundamental differences between the United States and Prussia has been overlooked by the Board of Education and its supporters. So Boston Quarterly Review says, we know what you guys are doing. You're trying to bring Prussian education here, and it's not American. In America, we believe in freedom. We believe in freedom of thought, and we don't want that Prussian stuff here. And seeing this reluctance, Horace Mann and the architects of modern schooling, they started with a small goal. They said, okay. We're only going to require about 10 to 12 weeks per year of compulsory schooling. And you don't have to send your 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds here like they do in Prussia. Just age 9 to age 12 for around 10 to 12 weeks. But then, of course, slowly their goal was to turn up that heat in the pot and let that frog begin to become acclimated to the concept, and the term would become longer and the age range would become longer. But again, there were prophetic speakers criticizing and saying this is not right. Many parents have kept their children at school nearly the year round, says Christian Education, page 12. The monotony of continual study wearies the mind. Can you imagine a society where we were actually keeping the children in school year round? Not so different from today, is it? But people were objecting to this, saying, why would they be in school all year? By 1890, you had every state in the Union enacted a compulsory schooling law, all but Massachusetts. Massachusetts came around finally in 1918. But even in the late 19th century, in the 1860s and 70s and 1850s, the majority of children were still evading the compulsory schooling laws. Only 26 to 42% of children were in school. So the majority of them were still living the traditional American life on their farms. And also I should mention that the schooling system in the 1850s and 60s and 70s and 80s was not purely Prussian from the start. There were a lot of actually quite rigorous educational principles being brought to the children. A lot of them were being brought into one-room schoolhouses so that they weren't age segregated like Mann called for. And a lot of them were doing skilled apprenticeships right alongside their schooling, their education. And also we had a shorter term and later schooling going on for the 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. So this was starting to backfire, if you will, on the planners of society. You're going to see they gain control a little bit later in the story. But the U.S. Bureau of Education recognized this problem, and they referred to what was called the problem of educational schooling. They said, they decried the fact that inculcating knowledge enables the masses to be able to perceive and calculate their grievances. Such an enabling is bound to retard the growth of industry. So the elites of society were saying, you know what, there's too much education going on. Industry is not going to grow when there's so much knowledge being inculcated into the masses, and they're going to start to have grievances about their situation in the industrial centers of America, and industry will not grow as fast. You're going to see this was a major reason for bringing Prussian education into America, was to do the same thing they were doing in Prussia, create a working class of human resources. More on that in just a minute. But these two gentlemen you see on the screen are from religious history. Wagner and Jones in 1888 were independent thinkers. They were questioning the reality of the status quo in the religious world. They were even confronting the religious establishment of their day with Bible truth from God. And you know what was happening in the same year in 1888? While independent thinking and the Spirit of God was moving in 1888, the schooling movement was moving forward, as the report of the Senate Committee on Education said, we believe that education is one of the principal causes of discontent of late years, manifesting itself among the laboring classes. So in 1888, the government was saying, look out, there's too much education going on again, they're going to become discontent. So they needed to take control of education and thus take control of the people. But in America, you don't take control of the people through imposing a dictatorship upon them. You don't come at them in your face with a military-style government. You're just not going to get away with that. Force will elicit counterforce. And so what they decided to do, and all the way in 1933, we have Louis Albert telling us what they were doing. It says they would accomplish by education what dictators in Europe are seeking to do by compulsion and force. Now, of course, dictators in Europe in 1933, you know who this is about. This is Hitler, Mussolini, and so on, and Stalin. So they're going to do, by education, what the dictators of Europe are doing by force. Take control of the people, right? The man you see on the screen is one of the most important individuals in forming 20th century American schooling. His name is Elwood Cubberley. He wrote the standard textbook of American history, of the American history of education. He states the following in this preface. The school reorganized its teaching along lines dictated by the new psychology of instruction, which had come to us from abroad. So where do you suppose he's talking about there? From abroad, a new psychology of educational instruction being Prussian style. Continuing the quote. Beginning about 1880 to 1885, our schools began to experience a new but steady change in purpose. So the purpose of education in America, the purpose of schooling, begins to change. And this was the great goal and aim from the 1840s when they founded it. They just didn't get to it now until the 1880s. And what is that change in purpose? Well, everything in the late 19th century, everything German was really in vogue in America. It was really popular and cool. The academics of America would they would go over to Europe, they would go to Germany, and they would study there and return with the coveted German PhD. And now they would go to work with this great credential of the highest PhDs in the world, and they would become American university presidents, department heads of different educational organizations, government officials, administrators of schools. And so in the late 19th century, this Prussianization of American schools really started to begin. American schooling as we know it today was founded during this period of roughly 1885 to 1920. And what was going on? In 1891, there were only 11 college education departments. So this just wasn't a big deal in America. But by 1919, there were 500 college education departments. At this time, they started to institute age-graded classrooms. So you're 7, you're with all the 7-year-olds. You're 8, you're with all the 8-year-olds. So they're segregating kids with their immediate peers. Also, a new concept started to emerge at this time, the concept of having separate departments for separate subjects. So learning started to become compartmentalized. You study social studies over here, you do this over here, and you're learning the disconnection of everything rather than understanding the world as a whole. Another thing that was happening is that there was a new innovation that I had never seen before. Kids were actually herded from room to room to learn different things at different times, and these bells would go off, just like Pavlov's dog, right? This is conditioning. This is a great training exercise. The children move from here to here. Bells are going off, and these are ideas, by the way, that's completely foreign to the history of education. We take it for granted, like, of course, there's bells and you move classes. That's how school goes. Well, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, this was not even in place. Teachers now started teaching the same subject over and over again to a new crowd, new group of students who would file into their rooms. And of course, that alienates so much the teacher-student relationship, that private tutor, that small one-room schoolhouse experience from the past in America. This whole system is compliance training. It has to do with efficiency. It has to do with system management. It has to do with training the population to be compliant industrial workers to follow what they're told. It has very little to do with true education. It's Prussian style, Jesuit to the core. And again, opposition arose to the schooling movement. This isn't something we just look back on and we say, wow, we can now find out what they were up to because we are good historians. No. People at the time knew exactly what they were up to. A spontaneous rebellion occurred in New York City in 1914. Students and parents protested these methods that were going on. Rioting burst out in 1917. Windows were smashed in New York City. Demonstrators said no way to the Prussianization of their children. In one instance, 5,000 children marched in protest, and especially the German immigrants complained that their children were being put on what they called half rations of education. They knew that this was a de-intellectualized, dumbed-down curriculum that was not meant for education. They said, we will not accept these half rations of education. We hear from other people that were speaking out at the time. New York City mayor was elected who called this Prussian schooling system a scheme. A system by which the Rockefellers and their allies hope to educate coming generations in the doctrine of contentment, another name for social serfdom. U.S. senators voiced opposition, saying they are moving with military precision all along the line to get control of the education of the children of the land. There are certain colleges that have sought endowments, and the agent of the Rockefeller Foundation or the General Education Board has gone out and examined the curriculum of these colleges and compelled certain changes. It seems to me one of the most dangerous things that can go on in a republic is to have an institution of this power apparently trying to shape and mold the thought of the young people of the country. And what was this institution he was talking about? The Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the Carnegie Endowment, the big financiers and industrialists of America were the ones who were seeking to take control of American education. Let's explore that theme just a bit further. There was a congressional investigation launched. You see the men on the screen right there. And the U.S. Congress blew the whistle on this. They said, look, these industrialists, these big foundations are spending more money forming American education and schooling than even the government. These are the guys that are gaining control over it. So the quote says this: the domination, this is the U.S. Congress reporting on what's going on, the domination of men in whose hands the final control of a large part of American industry rests is being rapidly extended to control the education and social services of the nation. Between 1896 and 1920, these guys were forming, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and all these names were forming, they were the architects of 20th century schooling. By the way, 40 years later, 4 decades later, the Congress also formed another commission to investigate these tax-free foundations, these big industrialists and big financiers, to see what kind of influence they were having upon American society. And in 1954, the Reese Commission reported something very similar as the 1913. The power of the individual large foundation is enormous. Its various forms of patronage carry with them elements of thought control. It exerts immense influence on educational processes, and educational institutions. It is capable of invisible coercion. It can materially predetermine the development of social and political concepts, academic opinion, thought leadership, and public opinion. So now you have 2 separate investigations, 1913 and 1954, one a Republican Congress, one a Democratic Congress. This is not about a political viewpoint here. And both of them drew the same conclusion. Schooling exists to serve corporate interests. Schooling is a controlled enterprise. And don't take their word for it, by the way. That's Congress doing an investigation. That's quite credible. But let the architects of modern schooling speak for themselves. Here you have John D. Rockefeller, and you don't need anybody's opinion. Just listen to what he has to say himself. These are the folks who created 20th century education, funded it. They funded the Columbia Teachers College, which turned out an enormous percentage of the teachers, superintendents, the presidents of other teacher training institutions. So these were the guys that were the money behind that. And if you're the money behind it, you're controlling that, right? Here's what the Rockefeller Board of Education stated. In our dreams, we have limitless resources. Now, it probably doesn't surprise you that the first billionaire in history, John D. Rockefeller, that his foundation would say, we dream of having limitless resources. And here's their dream. The people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The first time I read that, I understood, finally, what this schooling system was all about. It's not education. It's in our dreams, they yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. Reading on with the quote. The present educational conventions fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. So here he referred to the educational conventions and tradition. Now, what were those traditional education conventions in America? Well, these rural folks lived in small town America. They had true education. He says, these things fade from our mind, and we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people. Listen to what they're not trying to do. Everybody thinks this is what school is intended to do. He's saying it's not trying to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. So you've heard it straight from the horse's mouth. This is the Rockefeller Education Board, the single most important institution in the formation of schooling in America, saying, well, the goal is that they would just be docile and we would be able to mold them and they would yield themselves to us. We don't want them to become all of these accomplished people. We just want our goodwill to be worked upon them. And of course that means they're going to become compliant industrial cogs in our great machine for the uplifting of the economy, for the lining of the pockets of the elite. Now, it's not just them, it's also the government. William Torrey Harris is perhaps more than any individual in the government had more influence in Prussianizing American schools. He was the U.S. Commissioner of Education from 1889 to 1906. He was also the editor of a very important journal called the Journal of Speculative Philosophy. This is what initiated a generation of American intellects into the Prussian way of thinking. So, William Torrey Harris, what did he have to say about the intention of schooling? He says, 99 students out of 100 are automatons. This means robots. Reading on with the quote. Careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom, this is not an accident, but the result of substantial, what he calls education, which scientifically defined, now listen to the definition of education, according to one of the most important individuals in the formation of American schooling, the subsumption of the individual. Education, scientifically defined, is the subsumption of the individual, to subsume individuality into the great collective. We want to alienate people from their own individuality. We want the conventional education, the traditions of the past, to give way to this new system. Scientific definition of education is removing you from your individuality. So it's the mega corporations, the big financiers and industrialists. It's the government officials. But also remember that this system is Jesuit to the core. So this is at its roots a religious movement. Listen to Bertrand Russell on this. He says, education in a scientific society, and by the way, a scientific society just means a society that is socially engineered. It's scientifically organized by the masters and the social engineers of society. He says, education in a scientific society may, I think, be best conceived after the analogy of the education provided by the Jesuits. In like manner, the scientific rulers will provide one kind of education for ordinary men and women, and another for those who are to become holders of scientific power. Ordinary men and women will be expected to be, here we hear it again, docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. And then he says, of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researches of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. So we want total control over the population. We'll even use biochemistry. More on that in the second session. We're going to use psychoanalysis. We're going to make sure that they are contented with their lot in life and that they are not ambitious to go beyond what we have assigned them. Woodrow Wilson said something similar. He said, we want one class to have a liberal education. By the way, liberal doesn't mean politically liberal or conservative. He just means a free and full and thorough education where they're learning a lot. One class has a good education. We want another class a very much larger class of necessity to forego the privilege of a liberal education to fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. They are to work in the industrial system and serve as their masters say. And of course, we don't want them to be thinkers. We don't want them to be truly educated. You heard the quotes from earlier. Oh no, education is a cause of discontentment in the working class. And here they're going to be able to think about their own grievances because they have too much ability to think. That's what they were saying. So no, we want them to have this sort of education. In fact, the National Education Association in 1911, 1917, and 1918, where they criticized traditional American bookish curricula. You see, the kids are reading too much. They can't be reading so much because that's going to inculcate too much knowledge. And then they go on and say, this is responsible for leading tens of thousands of boys and girls away from pursuits for which they are adapted. Now, you know what they mean by that. Pursuits for which they are adapted means doing what needs to be done in the factory system of America. By the way, these reports also called for the replacement of history classes and putting in its place social studies. So sure, they will study society and they will get the blueprint that we give them. They will get their imprint of what society ought to look like. More on that in the second session. But history, that's dangerous. If they understand their history, if they understand too much, if they're able to think critically and analyze patterns and detect political agendas and weigh contexts and see what's going on, that would actually not be good if they learned true history. By the way, I was a history teacher for a number of years. And as I've looked at the history profession and history classes as they're done in America even today, it's a joke. We're not even teaching them the basic facts, and that's what we're supposedly trying to do. But if you try to teach the basic facts, here's the results. You don't teach them true history, you just teach some isolated facts. In 2001, the National Assessment of Educational Progress exam given to high school seniors found that a full 52% of American seniors chose Germany, Japan, or Italy in a multiple choice question as a U.S. ally in World War II. We also had 2/3 of these students could not explain a photo of a theater where the doorway read colored entrance. Also, the majority scored below basic in history knowledge, and this basic level, by the way, is an extremely low bar to begin with. There was another one put out in 2000 where college seniors this time, didn't fare much better. Students at the top 55 colleges in America were tested on history knowledge, and here were the results. Only 19% of them scored at a C or higher. Another similar test found that they actually looked at incoming freshmen and seniors, and both scored an F on basic history knowledge. In some cases, these college students were scoring lower as seniors than as entry-level students. So 4 years of college had made them even more ignorant of history. There was a question on the exam that they gave these students about the statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Less than half of these college students knew that came from the Declaration of Independence. Many of them thought it came from the Communist Manifesto. They selected that as a multiple choice option. So that shows where the college history profession has gone. But back to the financiers and industrialists, this is Frank Vanderlip. He was the president of National City Bank of New York. He explains to you why they favored Prussian education. Why? He goes on and says, I am firmly convinced the economic success of Germany can be encompassed in a single word, schoolmaster. From the economic point of view, the school system of Germany stands unparalleled. And the reason the economy would grow so fast is because you are systematizing and organizing and industrializing everything in the hands of a few. When they monopolize production, they say, we will do it the most efficient. They wrote a lot and talked a lot about this great fear they had. Overproduction. That word basically meant too many people doing too much production out there. They need to leave it in our hands. And so these big businessmen, the robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th century, feared overproduction. And they said, no, we will have an efficient economy if the people serve in their place. Now, it wasn't just Frank Vanderlip. But Frederick Winslow Taylor was a very important individual in systematizing everything. He founded the field of what was called scientific management, which is about maximize efficiency, turn everything into system, scientifically design everything like a machine. And here's what he had to say. In the past, man has been first. In the future, the system must be first. What I demand of the worker is not to produce any longer by his own initiative, but to execute punctiliously the orders given down to their minutest details. So you see, the schooling system is not to develop initiative. It's not to develop creativity. We don't want that. We want them docile. We want them to just execute punctiliously exactly what we tell them to do. And we also hear from H.H. Goddard. He called it the perfect organization of the hive. Taylor's system of scientific management would take over society. It was absolutely the rage in the early 20th century. Everybody was talking about scientific management, organized, system, efficiency. In fact, there was one letter to the editor that was published in The Nation magazine in 1911. I find this humorous. The guy writes in and says, "I am tired of scientific management, so-called. I have heard of it from scientific managers, from university presidents, from casual acquaintances in railway trains. I have read of it in the daily papers, the weekly paper, the 10-cent magazine, and the Outlook. The mass of articles on scientific management threaten to crush all thought out of my brain." And maybe that's actually the intention of scientific management. We don't want them thinking, crush all thought out of their brain. You get the mechanization of society. And by the way, this is going on in the big cities of America at the time that this book, Fundamentals of Christian Education by E.G. White, listen to this statement. This is a criticism of what's going on. She writes, "The very atmosphere of these cities is full of poisonous malaria. The freedom of individual action is not respected. A man's time is not regarded as really his own. He is expected to do as others do. All this is false education." Did you hear it, brothers and sisters? It is false education to say, fall in line, do what others do, be a part of the system. No, think for yourself. The same writer wrote that students should be taught to be thinkers, not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. John Taylor Gatto was the New York State and New York City Teacher of the Year, also a historian, and he wrote the following about what was going on at this time. He says, "Nothing posed a more formidable obstacle than the American family. The American family grew and produced its own food, cooked and served it, made its own soap and clothing, and provided its own transportation, entertainment, healthcare, and old age assistance. It entered freely into the cooperative associations with neighbors, not corporations. If that way of life had continued successfully, as it has for the modern Amish, it would have spelled curtains for the corporate society. An intricately subordinated industrial commercial system has only limited use for hundreds of millions of self-reliant, resourceful readers and critical thinkers." So the American family stood in the way. And at the time, childhood in America certainly existed as it ought, but childhood didn't perpetuate itself into the teen years and into adolescence. In 1904, the concept of an adolescent was invented by G. Stanley Hall. He was the first assistant to, guess who? The prophet of modern schooling, Wilhelm Wundt. And so G. Stanley Hall wrote about adolescence, and he said, at the ages of these what we would call the teenage years, that the children need to be kept in school. So they extended childhood. In American history 150 years ago, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old started to dress like an adult, act like an adult. It was the division between childhood and youth. Youth was an age of becoming an adult, not this extended childhood period of adolescence where you're in this phase where you're your own thing. No. It was a time where you started taking on adult responsibilities. You started being apprenticed into a job. And this was something that could not be, right? G. Stanley Hall wrote that these teenagers are a dangerous group because we've got to corral them into this system in order to get everybody to think the way that we need them to think. Because they'll become initiative. They'll become having an initiative and become independent thinkers. And that's a dangerous, dangerous thing. Well, even as late as 1930, as we close this first session, not everything was under the control of these architects of modern schooling. Old-fashioned teachers were still having this disturbing proclivity to stress heavy reading assignments, intense and challenging dialogue and discussion, reading assignments that were very rigorous. There were still 150,000 one-room schoolhouses in America, even as late as 1930. So while they founded this Prussian system in the early part of the 20th century, they didn't consolidate it completely until the last half of the 20th century. So stick around for part 2, where we're going to see how this system was consolidated, and we're going to see the methods of control and social engineering that were used in the 20th century, not just as an economic motive to get an industrial system underway, but to control the worldviews of these masses. Social engineering, social control to harness the minds of the masses, which we heard at the very beginning of this presentation, that the powers of darkness will seek to gain control of the human mind. I'm going to close session 1 with a quote from Fundamentals of Christian Education. I beg of parents to place their children where they will not be bewitched by false education. You see, this is a movement of Satan. This is witchcraft. This is spiritualism. This is something that's not mere human beings with mere political and economic agendas. This is something that the devil is seeking to do to capture their minds, to bewitch their minds. Reading on with the quote. Their only safety is in learning of Christ. He is the great central light of the world. All other lights, all other wisdom are foolishness.